welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. So this week we are making up for the fact that Voss had been the third video we filmed in a single day, and we now know we don't film two things in a week, let alone two things in a day, let alone three things in a day. So I wasn't happy with the original Voss video, so it's being taken down, and this is the new Voss video. So before we get to that, remember, if you want to support us, there is our shop where we have books and writing services. There is also our Redbubble shop where there are over 100 designs, so that you can support us by going to either of those. If you don't want to spend any money, fair enough, fully understand. Like, subscribe, comment and share. We especially like seeing people's comments if they're polite. So definitely encourage people to engage with us in one way or another. So, what are we doing? Well, I just told you what we're doing. We're doing Voss. We're doing Voss because we haven't finished reading Rasselas, which we were going to do, but Dr. Johnson, like Patrick White, requires the respect due to him and to not rush that. So we're making it up to Patrick White this week, and next week Her Ladyship will bring Rasselas, which I think will be the last Johnson that we have a look at. So, Voss. We all know Voss, I think. If you're Australian, you probably know of Voss, but you don't know Voss. So this is the third work that Patrick White wrote after returning to Australia. It's the third of the big Australian novels that he wrote. So The Aunt Story, which we haven't done, Tree of Man, then Voss. He actually he'd started thinking about Voss very, very early. I was having a look at Ma's excellent biography. Now, I think we will actually have to have a look at David Marr's biography, because if you're reading Patrick White, that is pretty much a requisite extra reading to go with Patrick White. I mean, Patrick White is not, doesn't require a load of deciphering, but the David Marr work is a standalone book in its own right, and one that reading Patrick White really benefits from having the truly exhaustive research that David Marr went into and was able to incorporate into that work. So we know that Patrick White was thinking about a story based on Leichhardt and a little bit of Leichhardt, a little bit of Eyre, for a very long time before he'd even fully relocated back to Australia. So we do know that. Voss is, if The Tree of Man is the story of the settlers, people settling in an area and developing and having that life and having that solid, authentic life. Voss is something altogether different. Ostensibly, it is about the explorers. The explorers into the interior, in particular Leichhardt, who disappeared west of the Darling Downs. His whole expedition disappeared. Basically, they died out there and no trace was ever found again. But this book is very much, it's an Australian Gothic, but it's a highbrow Australian Gothic. It's very different from any of the other Australian Gothics that we've had a look at, because this is an Australian Gothic, but it's not necessarily the characters themselves that are being examined within that Gothic context. It's Australia itself. It's white Australia, in particular, white settler Australia as a whole. There is no frontier, beyond this point we enter the Gothic, Australia as a whole is, in some respects, the subject of the Gothic. Now, the two biggest characters in this are Voss, the German explorer, and Laura Trevelyan, who is the daughter of one of Voss's backers. Thus, we have this costume, explorer, and Laura Trevelyan. It's my Voss homage. If I'm going to pay homage to Australian literature, we're going to do it in style. Big one. My jokes are a bit meta. I will say that. My jokes are a bit meta. Probably very few people got that as a joke. But nevertheless. Laura Trevelyan is the daughter of one of his backers. And between these two, they write letters that are never delivered. They have a psychic link with one another. This mad German out in the middle of nowhere, or rather, not the middle of nowhere, west of the Darling Downs, and this young woman in a privileged household on the coast in Sydney. So that's one level of weirdness that this book has. This book is, although it's supposed to be about exploration, it's really hallucinatory. It's very dreamlike. It's not a book that's a straight, realist narrative. This is white fella dreaming, which is a term that has been used in reference to our cinema, but I would say that this is also white fella dreaming. It is a monumental novel. It is a novel that is telling the Australia of the 1950s, hey, you are capable of something far better than the parochial brick by brick stuff that constitutes Australian writing at this point. I mean, you take My Brother Jack, George Johnson, which I found so tedious I couldn't finish because the writing is journalistic, and it's like, I would like to read this, but David is a prig and the writing is dull. And then along comes Patrick White, and he gives you this elevated language. This is highly elevated language. This epic vista of exploration of the country. And he also gives us a reflection of ourselves. Now, you might remember when I talked about Riders in the Chariot, that part of what people are intimidated about with Voss is that he holds a mirror up to ourselves and says, this is you, and if we don't like that reflection of ourselves, then that's part of the reason why people avoid Patrick White. He's very keen at observing who we are. He refuses to let anyone off the hook. This is not, now, a lesser writer, a much, much lesser writer would make this a very self-congratulatory novel, a very epic, a very, colonialist, a very essentially racist, white settler against the landscape. Patrick White does not fall into that trap. In fact, I was thinking about this in terms of, before talking about this, because I didn't reread it. If I didn't have enough time to read Rassilais, I certainly didn't have enough time to reread Voss. But Voss is one of those things where you don't need to reread it over and over again. It sinks into you. You know, I will reread all the Patrick Whites again, but at the moment I have a lot of other things that I'm wanting to read. I've read them within the last within the last about 10 years. So, you know, if I picked this up and started reading it again, I would start to feel bored because I'd remember it all. But Patrick White doesn't give you that sort of Eleanor Dark kind of, because that's the other one that was around at this period, is Eleanor Dark and her big colonial, The Timeless Land, which is very much the colonialist expansion. Remember, the 1950s is only 20 years removed from the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the English in Botany Bay in 1938. So this is being written within about 20 years of that. And that event was an incredibly colonial, incredibly racist. It initiated it, like the celebrations around that initiated a lot of protest from Indigenous people. I believe that was the beginning of Sorry Day, and it was seen from an Indigenous perspective as a day of, which became a day of mourning. So you have this still very self-congratulatory culture, this culture that is still very much not attempting, and I don't say we have succeeded, because we certainly haven't succeeded, but there have been many more attempts to decolonialise the Australian mentality, which would only benefit us, really. But that this is a world in the 50s that centres white Australia and white Australia's experience. So when Patrick White writes this novel that is not self-congratulatory, that is actually, and I didn't realise this when I first read it, but thinking back on it and having read Killing for Country, the other David Marr, big David Marr work, the one that we did a few months back, the centrality of money and vested interests in colonial and really today, but in the driving of the direction of Australia is much more apparent than I actually realised when I first read this book, because you spend a lot of time at the beginning of the book with the monetary backers, what they're sending Voss out. This is not some altruistic, oh yes, let's go find out what's happening in the interior of the country. This is, no, we are looking for new lands to exploit. We are looking to push out into further and further out from the colonies on the coast into the interior to find more places to exploit, to make money out of, because the prime focus in Australia from settlement to the point that this is writing into the future is, no, we are, and this is part of the reason for the neglect, for the lack of really mainstream interest in artistic developments in this country. It's why novels were left to journalists to write in journalese, why the novels that are touted are things that are like A Timeless Land, big, epic, colonialist works, is because it's an area that is sort of neglected. It's not an area that is considered important, when what is important is extracting every last pound or every last dollar that the country can provide. this is why in the 60s Donald Horne is saying we're the lucky country. We are a country that has abandoned its intellectualism to the schoolmaster and the journalist and has ridden off the resources that are available to it. And Patrick White comes in. Patrick White is the finest writer in Australia at this time. He's probably the finest writer we have, full stop. And he writes this. And it's not self-congratulatory, and it's critical, and it's basically saying you are not comfortable in your own country. We are not, in terms of as the Australians, the people that he's talking about, we are not Laura Trevelyan, who understands, has a spiritual aspect to her and understands the importance of the spiritual. Laura Trevelyan is where we should aspire to be. We are Voss, his backers, his men, people who are out to extract everything we possibly can from the land, who are not interested in what we are seeing, who are not interested in finding any spiritual connection with either each other, with the place that we find ourselves. We are mercantile and grasping. And White is critical of this. By the end of the novel, Voss does develop that spiritual awakening that he needs. But for most of the novel, he is deeply unpleasant, extraordinarily selfish, megalomaniacal, egomaniacal, delusions of godlike grandeur. He's mad. Is the book of the mad German out in the middle of nowhere, or not middle of nowhere, west of the Darling Downs. And I think Voss's madness is very deliberate, because that grasping material quality, what is that other than madness? When there is no attachment to the spiritual, when there is, which is a central figure, a central theme in all of White's novels. All of White's novels are about the importance of the spiritual, and he does mean spiritual, not religious. He's not expecting people to adhere to a particular code, because again, a particular code brings all of that concept of colonialism and imposition. But to have a spiritual connection, to have a spiritual life, because people without a spiritual life are empty husks. They are animalistic. They are not properly human. And time again, Patrick White shows how being without a spiritual life leaves you bereft. What else with this? As I said, this is hallucinatory. And I think that is a bit of a commentary on Australian history. When we think of Australian history, when Australians think of their own history, it's not like other cultures that think of their own history. Other cultures will know things about their own history in very definite terms. They might turn them into legend, they might lord them over overly, but they do have a sense of their history. They have a chronological sense. They have a sense that these people lived at this time. Now, I don't know if this is entirely the schooling that I received or if this is actually deliberate, but there is a sense with Australia that especially our colonial history. We learn a lot about our 20th century history because our 20th century history has been, in part, living history. We have had a culture that has decided that history begins at World War One, and if you want to, with Gallipoli and the Anzacs, and if you want to push back at that, history begins at Federation. But the colonial bit, that's over there. That's over there, and that's where the messy stuff happens. We don't necessarily want to look too closely at that. I think I talked about this with Killing for Country. Our concept of history is convicts, explorers, bushrangers, gold. There's a lot of stuff that happened in that century and a bit, that we don't want to look at. And we don't want to look at because it is some of our most shameful history. It is the part of our history that saw the most overt violence perpetuated against the Indigenous people of this country. It is the part of history that we know it's there, but best keep it sort of a bit covered. We don't really want to go into that. We don't have, because of the time period when Australia was settled, we don't have we are an Enlightenment period country. We don't have the religious aspect that other colonies have, like America. There is no witch hunts. It actually accounts for why a lot of Australian culture is so incredibly secular. Although people are religious, religion is seen as a private and personal thing. And again, religion, not spirituality. Patrick White is not interested in religion. He's interested in spirituality, which he sees as a non-denominational and communal important aspect that we are neglecting. But we do look at, there are a few explorers, and Leichhardt's one of them. We all know who Leichhardt is. We think he's the German who got lost and disappeared and we never saw again, like Burke and Wills, that sort of thing. Just about every town in Australia has a Leichhardt Street, and there is, I think, a Leichhardt in every state. There's a Leichhardt in Sydney. So we know the name, we just don't know what it's attached to or when it's attached to. And I think that's why this is such a dreamy sort of novel. This is the hazy pre-history of Australian consciousness. We know these figures, but they're not real people, especially. When Patrick White wrote this, Manning Clark hadn't written his writing. Manning Clark is one of the people who is starting to, actually, we have to look at our country more clear-eyed and more honestly. So the history, much like the cultural aspects of Australia, were being neglected. What was seen as important was English history, not Australian history. So this is a very hazy world, and it's a dreamlike world that White creates in this book, which is an interesting thing. The third thing that I wanted to talk about with this is the fact that this, like Riders in the Chariot, has Indigenous characters. It does have Indigenous characters, which is a new element to the Australian novel. Are the Indigenous characters perfect? No. Do we expect a book written in the 1950s to have perfectly wrought, nuanced Indigenous characters? Unless it's written by an Indigenous person? No, I wouldn't be. But one thing that is important, that the history is barely even speaking of. The history is barely even speaking of. The laws are still the highly repressive, child stealing, heavily controlling laws that came in with Federation by the 1950s. Indigenous voices are becoming louder in protest, but not really until not properly until the 1960s. Indigenous people are slowly appearing in the public. Someone like Albert Namatjira, the watercolor painter, but he's appearing in the public sphere because he is painting in a European manner. This is a period before the Central Australian Indigenous artworks started appearing in white Australia. So, no, they're not perfect. They are better than The Fringe of Leaves, which I honestly haven't finished. I sort of got stuck somewhere in that, and I don't know if I will finish it. I think it's generally considered you can skip The Fringe of Leaves. But the Indigenous people in this are on the edges, but they are there. And because of the way Patrick White writes this, because you are so invested with the explorers, when you see the Indigenous people, you don't always see them. And I think that's it is deliberate, and it's only when you read it and and actively start thinking about that you realize, oh yes, because it's the intentions and the actions of the Indigenous people are not written with judgment. They're written as these are the events. Patrick White is not offering a judgment, and it's up to you as a reader to sort of work out where you are with that. I think particularly one bit that caught me by surprise when I read it and then thinking back over it again was there is a Aboriginal man who is given to Voss and the party by like the most remote settler on the Darling Downs, at the edge of the settlement. And when Voss and the party become stuck and need resupply, they send this man back east with letters. And this man gets out of sight, and all of a sudden he has freedom. He's no longer enslaved by the settler who gave him to Voss. Voss has gone and said, oh no, you can go back. There's no one escorting him, no physical impediment to him, and he takes his freedom. He tears up the letters, he strips off the clothes that he has been given, and he leaves to join his people. Because why wouldn't he? Now, when you're reading this, there is an element of, oh, that was probably their last option. But there is an element in this which is a bit like Fitzcarraldo. Fitzcarraldo is like Voss. He has this idea that he's going to enact, and Fitzcarraldo uses the Indigenous people to enact this. And he doesn't really question why they're helping him. they have their own intentions. They have their own agenda behind helping do this and putting in all this work to move this shit. The Indigenous people are kind of the same in Voss. Voss has his goal and his intention, and he encounters Indigenous people and does not really question that they are not tools for him to use, only to discover they're not tools for him to use. They have their own agenda, their own understanding of what is happening, and for all of his thoughts of being superior, he soon discovers that he is not superior when he is on their turf. And one of the things that Patrick White does is he doesn't give us too much of a close-up view of the Indigenous people of the Western Desert, or the desert beyond the Darling Downs. They remain unknowable. Because how could White knew I think White knew his limitation there. He knew that how could he, from his perspective, write Indigenous people from beyond the Darling Downs who have never seen white people before, who live in this environment that is killing the exploration party, who can't find water, who are dying of thirst, meet a thriving community of people. A thriving community of people who blend in so well with their environment, who coexist so well in their environment that Patrick White refers to them as being like burnt sticks. And I don't think he means this in terms of othering in a racist way. I don't think that is Patrick White's intention, because these characters are not animalistic. They are not. They are written as characters with dignity and an agenda. But I think what he means by burnt sticks is the fact that they look like they belong in that environment. They look and they live and they have adapted themselves in a way that means that their lives are supported by the land that they live on. The Europeans have to adapt the land to live on it. The Indigenous people live on the land. They don't have to adapt the land to them, they adapt to the land. And that is what I think he means by burnt sticks. The end of the novel has a memorial to them. And one lone survivor who tells this story of them. And it's the beginning of the mythologizing, the beginning of the covering all of this uncomfortableness over with a smooth, calm, and reassuring story. Okay, he got lost and that's a mystery, but this doesn't need to upset what is happening here, that progress will continue. And that is probably the part of it that is Patrick White being very scathing at the end. Is this is you never learn. You keep doing this. You don't learn. If you don't learn, you're never going to develop. And so Voss, you should read it. It's not really a hard book. I mean, if you're not used to Patrick White, it's actually probably a pretty good one to work on. There are harder Patrick Whites, The Eye of the Storm. I'll bring that at some point, but that is a hard Patrick White. But that's 1970s Patrick White. 1950s and 1960s Patrick White is actually really accessible for Patrick White. But there we go. I think that this time I have done Patrick White more justice than he got in the first place. I certainly know that I've read some things since doing my first video that have impacted how I would read this book now, which is always the way. But I hope you enjoyed this redo of Voss. By the time you watch this, I will have removed the original, so there's no point going back. I did start watching it and realised within about 5 minutes, oh, I have to redo this. I can't leave this one up. So her ladyship is doing a couple of redos, but I think we're leaving the originals up. Voss was the only one I wanted to actually take down and fully redo. So now we've done it. I'm not sure what I'll bring next time. Might bring some Dorothy Porter. I think people like the Monkey's Mask, so maybe we might have a bit of a look at some more Dorothy Porter. Like Dorothy Porter. Otherwise I have some other things to read. It all depends on how quickly I read things. But I hope you enjoyed your trip into the interior, into the Australian Gothic with Voss. That's 2 Gothics in a row. And anyway, I will be back another time with another adventure in Australian literature. Bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.